Usually when you make a major life decision, like, say, buying a car, there's this expectation of rationality.
Right, you check the safety ratings, the gas mileage.
Exactly. You test drive it, it's very calculated. But then you step into the world of human relationships, of choosing a partner, and suddenly it's like putting on a blindfold, handing the keys to a total stranger, and just, hoping for the best.
It really is a fascinating paradox because, choosing a partner feels like the ultimate exercise of free will. But when you dig into the underlying mechanics of attraction, it's actually a deeply unconscious process.
And decoding that invisible map is exactly the mission of today's deep dive. So whether you are trying to untangle your own messy relationship history, or, you're just insanely curious about why humans do what they do, we are giving you a completely new lens on your behavior.
Yeah, and we've got a fantastic stack of sources to go through today. We're looking at original essays by Sigmund Freud, specifically on narcissism and beyond the pleasure principle, and we're weaving those together with modern therapeutic frameworks, neuroscientific analyses of trauma, and
we definitely can't forget those fierce feminist critiques that completely dismantled a lot of early psychoanalysis.
Oh, absolutely. It's a remarkable progression of ideas.
Right.
We're breaking down the hidden forces that dictate who you love, why you might physically and neurologically repeat toxic patterns, and how early psychology managed to both illuminate the mind and, profoundly hinder our understanding of gender.
Right. So, to understand why relationships go wrong, we really first have to understand the mechanics of how we fall in love in the first place. And Freud had this very specific, almost economic way of looking at it.
He did. It revolves around this concept he called cathexis.
Cathexis?
Yeah. In psychoanalysis, cathexis is basically the emotional investment of your libido, which he defined as your psychic or vital energy into an object or a person. And Freud viewed this energy as a strictly finite resource.
Okay, finite, like a budget.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He imagined this constant seesaw between what he called ego libido, which is your baseline self-regard, and object libido, which is the energy you extend outward to love someone else.
So if I'm tracking his logic here, this is essentially like a battery.
That's a perfect way to visualize it.
Right, so if I plug someone else into my internal power source and just start pouring my energy into loving them, my own charge inherently drops.
Yeah, loving someone literally lowers your own self-regard because you're expending your vital energy on them. And according to his framework on narcissism, that depleted battery is only replenished when the object of your affection returns the love.
Oh, wow. So when they validate you, the energy flows back.
Exactly, and your ego libido is restored.
Which completely explains the physiological exhaustion of unrequited love. If you're pouring energy into a void and getting nothing back, you're just walking around with a perpetually drained battery.
You are. But Freud also breaks down romantic infatuation into something else, something he calls an aim-inhibited instinct.
Okay, let's unpack this because aim-inhibited sounds incredibly clinical for something as wild as falling in love.
It sounds clinical, but the mechanism is wild. So an aim-inhibited instinct is an emotional tie that originally, maybe in early childhood, had a direct sexual aim. But because acting on it was forbidden or repressed, the goal got blocked.
Okay, so what happens to it?
Well, what remains after that repression is what we call tender affection. And when someone falls deeply into infatuation, they engage in radical idealization.
Meaning they just put the person on a massive pedestal?
Way beyond a pedestal. The loved object is suddenly perceived as entirely free from criticism. All their flaws are invisible or, magically reinterpreted as cute little quirks. They are vastly overvalued. Ultimately, the person you love consumes your ego to the point where they actually take the place of your own ego ideal.
Wait, the ego ideal, remind me what that is.
It's your internal compass of perfection, your highest moral conscience.
Hold on, so you are literally handing over the steering wheel of your own moral compass and self-worth to someone else. You're trying to satisfy your own narcissism by basically possessing a person who represents what you want to be.
That's exactly the mechanism Freud described. In fact, in his 1921 work, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, he draws a direct, striking parallel between being in love and being hypnotized.
Wait, really falling in love is a trance state?
Yeah. He essentially called hypnosis a group formation with two members, just with the explicitly sexual tendencies temporarily excluded. Look at the similarities. Both the hypnotized subject and the deeply infatuated lover share the exact same humble subjection.
Oh, I see.
The same blind compliance and a total suspension of reality testing. In both scenarios, the external figure, whether it's the hypnotist or the lover, steps entirely into the place of the ego ideal.
You just completely lose your critical faculty. But, I mean, there have to be a breaking point, right? Because requiring that total, terrifying surrender to a stranger sounds incredibly dangerous.
It is deeply vulnerable.
Right, so it makes sense that the human mind would eventually set up these drastic psychological firewalls to protect itself. Which brings us to this fascinating and frankly disruptive fracturing of desire.
Yes, that terrifying surrender is exactly what leads to what Freud identified in 1912 as psychical impotence. Although today, we commonly call it the Madonna whore complex.
And this happens when the brain totally fails to merge those two currents we just talked about. The tender, affectionate love and the sensual, physical desire.
Right. The mechanism here is a profound psychological split. You see, the tender currents of love are rooted in our earliest childhood attachments. Because those attachments are associated with safety and caretaking, mixing them with adult sensual desire creates intense, unconscious anxiety.
The mind just panics at the cross-contamination.
Exactly. The mind panics. The result is a devastating firewall. Where this person loves, they experience absolutely no physical desire. And where they desire, they cannot allow themselves to love.
So it's complete compartmentalization.
It really is. To achieve full sexual potency, the individual requires a partner they view as degraded or ethically inferior. Because their mind associates sex with something inherently dirty or forbidden, they have to keep their sensuality entirely isolated from the partners they actually respect.
We see this archetype everywhere in culture. Titian painted it centuries ago in Sacred and Profane Love.
Oh, absolutely.
You see it in Hitchcock's film Vertigo, where Kim Novak literally plays the two contrasting halves of the split for the protagonist. Even Scorsese's Taxi Driver leans heavily on this exact psychological sorting mechanism. But I have to ask, when we talk about this, it's almost exclusively framed as male neurosis. So what does this all mean for women in modern relationships?
That is a critical transition to make. Because modern sociology provides some really necessary context here. You can't just view the Madonna whore complex as an isolated individual pathology. Sociologists argue it functions as a broad cultural mechanism.
Yeah, sociologists like Simon and Gagnon, who developed sexual script theory, completely reframe this. They look at how this dichotomy actively controls women's autonomy.
Right.
Because the traditional script frames the heterosexual male as the natural pursuer of sex, and the woman is forced into the role of the gatekeeper of purity.
And researchers like Emily Kane build on that. They point out how assertive female sexuality is often culturally interpreted as a direct threat to male social dominance.
So when you view it through a sociological lens, critics argue this dichotomy serves as a societal tool to police female behavior.
Exactly. It preserves patriarchal power structures by punishing women who step outside the pure role with societal slut-shaming, while simultaneously denying men the ability to have fully integrated, emotionally intimate physical relationships.
Basically a psychological sorting system where absolutely everybody loses.
Everybody loses, yeah.
But there is a massive flaw in assuming we only categorize people to find a sense of purity or safety. Because here's where it gets really interesting. What if the brain isn't looking for safety at all? What if it's unconsciously hunting for a familiar type of pain?
Yes. That introduces one of the most vital concepts in psychoanalysis, repetition compulsion. Freud outlined this in his 1920 essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
Okay, repetition compulsion.
It's the unconscious drive to reenact early, highly distressing relational dynamics in our adult lives.
So if someone keeps dating emotionally unavailable partners, or repeatedly finds themselves in volatile, chaotic relationships, it's not random. But it's also not a moral failing, right? I mean, they aren't consciously choosing to be miserable.
Far from it. Modern therapists and trauma researchers view repetition compulsion as an unconscious, desperate attempt by the psyche to gain mastery over unresolved trauma.
Mastery. So you're trying to rewrite history.
Exactly. Your brain compels you to recreate the original painful scenario with the hidden hope that this time around you'll be powerful enough to change the outcome. You are trying to finally get it right.
Okay, to bring this into a modern context, psychologists like John Bowlby developed the concept of the internal working model. Basically, your childhood environment provides the architectural blueprint for how relationships are supposed to function.
Right.
So if your blueprint was drawn in a chaotic, unpredictable house, peace and stability are going to feel incredibly unnatural to you.
And Bessel van der Kolk takes this even deeper in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. He demonstrates that these early relational dynamics aren't just abstract concepts floating in your mind. They're embedded as somatic physical memories in your nervous system.
Like your body memorizes it.
Yes, your body literally memorizes the physiological state of walking on eggshells around an inconsistent partner, and it codes that state as normal.
So if we know a relationship is toxic, why does the brain prefer a predictable nightmare over healthy unpredictability?
Because to the human nervous system, familiarity is synonymous with survival. Even if the familiar environment is painful, your brain knows exactly how to navigate it. It knows the rules of the chaos.
But a safe relationship is just totally unknown.
Completely uncharted territory. And to a traumatized amygdala, uncharted territory registers as an active threat. This creates what trauma expert Janina Fisher calls the empathic paradox.
Which is that phenomenon where insight alone doesn't cure the compulsion. You can sit there and rationally list all the red flags. You know it's bad for you, but your body still feels this overwhelming magnetic pull toward the person.
Because the pattern doesn't live in the logical part of your brain. It lives in procedural memory. It's physically held in the body. That's why traditional talk therapy often hits a wall here.
You can't just talk your way out of a nervous system response.
Right. Rewiring this requires somatic therapies like EMDR or repeated, safe, corrective emotional experiences to literally overwrite that trauma at the physical level.
Which is incredibly hard work. And when these physical trauma loops finally break down, when these repetitive relationships inevitably crash, the psychological fallout is just devastating.
Oh, it's catastrophic. Psychoanalytic literature actually outlines 5 specific tragic ends to this kind of intense infatuation.
Let's walk through these because they explain so much of human behavior post-breakup. What's the first one?
The first outcome involves the clash between 2 fundamental drives: Eros, which is the life and love drive, and Thanatos, the death drive.
Eros and Thanatos.
Yeah. When the intense love drive of Eros is thwarted by a breakup, Thanatos is unleashed. This manifests as severe self-destructive behaviors, a desire to obliterate the painful remnants of the bond, or even harm oneself.
It's basically the psychological equivalent of burning down the house because you can't live in it anymore.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the second outcome?
The second is the marital breakdown caused by that Madonna whore complex we discussed earlier. As a couple grows closer, they trigger the tender affection. But because the brain firewalled that off from sensuality, physical desire just plummets.
Right, they essentially become roommates.
Yeah, unable to bridge the gap between respect and eroticism, which eventually destroys the marriage.
The intimacy literally suffocates the desire. And the third outcome is just the endless loop of repetition compulsion itself, right?
Yes, the sheer exhaustion of it. Moving from partner to partner, recreating the exact same traumatic dynamic, never achieving that mastery. A psychological hamster wheel.
The fourth one is really fascinating to me. It's called obsessional neurosis. Freud documented this in his Ratman case study. How does love turn into that?
In obsessional neurosis, love turns into a stifling prison of anxiety. The individual becomes almost paralyzingly obsessed with the safety of their partner.
Constantly worrying they'll get into a car crash or something.
Right. But psychoanalysis reveals this is a defense mechanism called reaction formation. That overwhelming worry actually masks a deep, heavily repressed, ambivalent hatred toward the partner.
Wait, so because you are constantly picturing them getting into a fatal accident, you are secretly generating that image. You're hiding your hostility behind extreme caretaking.
Precisely. And the fifth outcome, which is arguably the most profound, is melancholia.
Let's really take our time with this one.
Yeah.
Because Freud makes a brilliant distinction in his 1917 essay, Mourning and Melancholia, between healthy grief and pathological depression.
He explains that mourning is painful but healthy. It relies on reality testing. You confront the reality that an external loss occurred, you process it, and eventually your free libido is detached and available to invest in someone new.
But melancholia, which is what we'd call severe clinical depression today, operates totally differently. The loss isn't processed externally.
No, it gets internalized.
It gets swallowed.
That is the core mechanism. In melancholia, you're dealing with the loss of an ambivalently loved object, someone you love deeply, but also fiercely resented.
Okay.
When that relationship ends, the psychic energy doesn't detach. Instead, the ego identifies with the abandoned person. The ego essentially merges with the lost partner.
It's like you've swallowed the person who hurt you whole. They're now living inside your mind, and your mind's immune system is violently attacking itself to try and get them out.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The rage, the bitter disappointment that was meant to be directed outward at the ex-partner is trapped. So it gets redirected inward against the self.
So the relentless self-reproach and depression, all those crushing feelings of worthlessness, Freud is arguing that those are often just displaced accusations against someone else.
The shadow of the object fell upon the ego. That's Freud's haunting phrase for it. You are punishing yourself with the anger you won't allow yourself to feel toward them.
That is just brilliantly insightful. But, we've been using Freud's architectural blueprints to understand the mind this whole time. And if we're going to do this honestly, we urgently have to examine the deep structural flaws in his foundation.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when it came to women, his theories were incredibly damaging.
This brings us to a really critical, deeply controversial turning point in psychology. Freud notoriously referred to women's psychology as dark continent.
Yeah.
His developmental framework posited that young girls experienced a traumatic phallic stage upon realizing they lacked male anatomy. He theorized this resulted in a profound sense of inferiority he termed penis envy.
And according to his essays, this supposed biological deficit led to a lifelong search for a substitute like a husband or a male child. And he even argued that because of this, women developed a permanently weakened superego, meaning less moral capacity than men.
And this wasn't just some eccentric theory he kept to himself. It actively shaped decades of mainstream research. For example, Calvin Hall's dream studies in 1964 analyzed thousands of dreams.
Right, and what did he find?
Well, he concluded that because women frequently dreamt of being victims of aggression, this was empirical evidence of their externalized, weaker superegos, just as Freud predicted.
But psychoanalytic feminists and modern scholars have entirely dismantled this, haven't they?
They have. And the pushback began from within his own ranks. Karen Horney, a pioneering female psychoanalyst, countered his biological determinism brilliantly.
With womb envy, right?
Yes. She argued that if we're basing psychology on anatomical envy, we must acknowledge womb envy. She suggested that men overcompensate with intense ambition and a drive to conquer, precisely because they're unconsciously envious of women's unique biological ability to create life.
And Alfred Adler completely rejected the idea that anatomy was destiny too. And then by the time we hit second-wave feminists like Kate Millett in her book Sexual Politics, along with Juliet Mitchell and Nancy Chartereau, the critique becomes fully sociological.
Right. They argue that the behaviors Freud observed in women weren't the result of missing anatomy. They were direct psychological adaptations to living under restrictive patriarchal structures.
Right. Critics view early psychoanalysis as fundamentally compromised by a lack of objectivity. They argue Freud was just observing the perfectly rational reactions of women trapped in an oppressive Victorian society and misdiagnosing those survival mechanisms as innate neuroses.
And this critique extends to serious ethical controversies regarding how we handle trauma, which writers like Jeffrey M. Messon and Florence Rush have highlighted vividly.
Yes, the historical abandonment of his seduction theory. Because originally in the 1890s, Freud actually believed his female patients when they reported memories of childhood sexual abuse.
He did. He initially theorized that this actual real-world trauma was the root cause of their psychological suffering.
He was on the verge of uncovering the reality of childhood trauma. But critics argue he actively suppressed his own findings.
According to historical analysis, Freud faced immense career-threatening backlash from his colleagues in Vienna. The suggestion that respected men in society were secretly abusing children was deemed entirely unacceptable.
And wasn't one of his close friends implicated?
Yes. His confidant Wilhelm Flies was suspected of abusing his own son.
So writers like Manson argue that to protect his career and his social circle, Freud rebranded his patients' actual memories of abuse as mere fantasies. He created the Oedipus complex to explain away their trauma.
Essentially telling victims they weren't abused, but rather unconsciously desired those taboo interactions. Critics view this as a massive failure of courage that delayed the clinical understanding of child abuse by nearly a century.
It's a stark historical warning. The very framework built to liberate the mind was altered to protect the status quo.
Exactly. It reminds us that even paradigm-shifting theories are always vulnerable to the personal biases of the people creating them.
Wow. We have covered incredible ground today. We went from the draining battery of Catholic hexes and the hypnotic trance of love to the psychological firewalls of the Madonna horror complex. We look at the somatic loops of repetition compulsion, the inward rage of melancholia, and finally, the feminist reckoning of Freud's legacy.
It's a lot to process, but the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, is that awareness is the first step toward true autonomy. By understanding these hidden forces, your internal working models, your displaced anger, you gain the levers to break your own repetitive cycles.
You can finally take the blindfold off and grab the steering wheel. But before we close, I know you have a final, really provocative thought that scales us up from the personal to something much larger.
I do. When we talk about repetition compulsion, we almost always apply it to individuals, but consider how this applies on a macro level. Could entire societies be suffering from collective repetition compulsion?
That is a staggering thought.
Think about it. Are we, as a culture, doomed to continuously repeat cycles of war, political polarization, and inequality simply because we haven't found a way to properly mourn and integrate our collective historical traumas?
Because if nations refuse to do the hard work of reality, testing their own pasts,
then they might be unconsciously compelled to reenact those exact same destructive dynamics over and over again on the world stage.
that is a chilling but incredibly necessary perspective to leave on. It makes you wonder what historical ghosts you might be trying to master in your own life. So think about that the next time you find yourself stuck in a loop. Are you driving the car, or is the past driving you? That's all for today's deep dive. Keep questioning the map.